This is the blank IEP form that the Florida Department of Education provides to all school sites. It will look much different when it's filled out, but I'm going to go over some of the important parts for classroom teachers to recognize. When the IEP team is considering whether or not a student requires supports, they will go through this list of behaviors or needs and go through the yes-no process. And then once they have determined that the student does or does not have, or does have needs in certain areas, they look at domains. And there is curriculum and instruction, curriculum and learning environment. There's independent functioning, communication, social emotional behavior, and healthcare. So a student could need help in one or more of these areas. General factors and assessment data. This is where the teacher planning notes also described to you come into play. Parent input is obtained through, and they fill this part out, the parents' concerns, health concerns. This is where results for statewide and district-wide assessments are inserted. Results of the initial or most recent evaluation. If this is a first-time evaluation, that's where that information goes, and it will remain in there even at added annual review times until more recent tests have been completed. This is an example of what the results would look like for an assessment. Domain, transition services, curriculum, and learning environment. So this is where you go into the different areas. So if this student needs support in mathematics, if they need support in language and emergent literacy, if they need support in, I guess you could really do independent functioning. This is where you'll see that they add annual goals and short-term objectives and benchmarks in each of those academic or functional performance areas. So anything that you put into the teacher planning notes feeds into this particular section. If for some reason you describe that they are unable to write on their own, that would go into independent functioning, and they would have a goal that supports, forming letters. If the student has a specific learning disability in the reading area and they're having difficulty in the emergent literacy area of understanding the difference between long and short vowel sounds, that's something that you would put in here, and they would have small objectives to meet the benchmarks or the annual goals. You would list what is the goal for this student, that by the end of 6 months or by the annual review, this child will be able to do X, Y, Z. And how will you know? Through the mastery criteria, if there's any other information, and what the assessment procedures will be for that, and the progress reports that will be provided. So the short-term objective or benchmarks will be listed here in order to reach the annual goal. In the computer system where these are developed, there's a drop-down menu, and a lot of special needs teachers rely heavily on that drop-down menu, but there's absolutely nothing that says you can create these measurable annual goals and the objectives and benchmarks just based on experience and knowledge of the student and what would best be small steps to reach the annual goal. So you are not limited to sticking to that particular drop-down menu. It's also very limited. It doesn't actually, it's just kind of a starting point for teachers. So if you see benchmarks or if you see objectives that you feel are not appropriate for the student, you have every right to speak in the meeting and, based on your experience with them, state that maybe it should be altered or completely rewritten. That's very common practice if the teacher wants to play that role. These are all very repetitive here. Annual goal, short-term objectives for every domain. Here's social emotional behavior. So if they have an issue in social emotional behavior, then this will be filled out. If not, it's actually missing from the final document. If it doesn't apply, it's removed. So here's the assessment area, and it explains how the student has been assessed. In some cases, it will be their general district-wide assessments or Florida alternative assessment, students' current grades. And this section determines whether or not the student will actually participate in state or district assessments. And this is The no is usually for students who are on alternative certificates, and generally you will not find them in your general education classroom. Special education services are included in here for specially designed instruction. If this is a student who is having a hard time completing assignments, that means that you would be paying attention to how frequent they are unable to finish, or you could also be looking at the duration of their off-task behavior. Related services, supplementary aid and services, extended school year services, that would be the summer reading that is provided, and they have to qualify for that. Classroom accommodations are changes in how the student accesses information and demonstrates performance in the general education setting. So this could be something like additional time to complete assignments, or maybe shortened assignments in some cases. There are many different classroom accommodations that you'll see across, depending on student need, and they're not the same for every student. Supports for school personnel. So the person responsible for transition services follow-up can be identified by title. Supports required for the student to advance appropriately towards attaining goals that can be involved in the process in the general education curriculum, and to be educated and participate with other students. So if there's any other kinds of support that the student needs, this is where they're described. Least restrictive environment. This is how you would explain to which extent they would that they will not participate with non-disabled students. So it means how often are they in the general education classroom with their typical peers, and are they removed from any activities based on their disability. And of course, the goal is to have them in their least restrictive environment and put them into gen ed as much as it's possible. This is accessibility and implementation. This is where you discuss any other needs that the student might have in order to participate in that least restrictive environment. And then there's a section for conference notes, and sometimes that will just be who was there to participate. And that is pretty much the long and the short of the IEP form.